Long time no see. I'm back with another video. Today we're covering Poetry Slam for Dummies. All right. So I'm going to be breaking down how Poetry Slam tend to work. What are the common rules for deciding, who goes first, who goes last? What about team slams versus solo slams, group pieces versus indies, right? I'm going to be getting into all that, explaining everything. So yeah, just get ready. We're about to jump right into it. Let's go. All right, so first things first, y'all know the drill. Like, subscribe, click the notification bell, comment below if you want more videos like this. I'm trying a little some different, right? And then also follow your boy on Instagram, Kendrick_Youngblood. All right, shameless plug over. Now, keep in mind, the best info is actually at the end of the video or towards the end of the video, so you actually want to watch the whole thing. I swear this will be worthwhile, all right? First things first, what is Poetry Slam? Slam is a performance-based competition in which contestants are judged on a point system according to their spoken word, aka their recited poetry, as well as how they performed it on stage in front of judges and an audience, right? Now, in order to really explain how Poetry Slam came about, we actually have to go to the origins of poetry in general. Poetry actually began as an oral tradition. In other words, it began as spoken word. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. Back during the time of the ancient Greeks, paper wasn't like a common commodity. I mean, it was a thing, but it was kind of expensive, and it was just much easier to just remember the poem that you've created in your head and just recite it. So that's really how it began. Of course, writing became more common eventually, and the rest is history. But keep in mind, poetry began as spoken word. So I know we talk about spoken word as like being like a new recent kind of thing, but it's actually the origin of poetry in general. As for the origin of slam poetry, that began in the 1980s in Chicago, Illinois, when a local poet and construction worker named Mark Smith felt that the poetry readings in his city had kind of been losing their passion and fervor, and he wanted to revitalize that. So he had an idea in which people would recite their poetry in a competition. And, based on their choreography, their performance, their inflection in their voices, things like that, they'd be judged and scored, right? And that really is where slam blew up, right? So slam, I believe, is a sport. And when I start going into the scoring rules and the structure and things like that, you'll see why I feel that way. Okay, so some scoring rules. These tend to vary by slam. I just want to start by saying that. In fact, a lot of the rules and structure aspects that I bring up in this video vary by slam. So I don't want y'all hitting me up saying, oh no, that's not how my slam does that. Yes, okay, I get it. But here's some common things I've noticed, right? So for starters, 5 judges write and present their scores, often on things like, whiteboards. They'll have a marker, write it down, show it to the scorekeeper, and then the scorekeeper will tally up the scores, right? The point system goes from 0.0 to 10.0, right? So it tends to go to the first decimal place. Now, 0.0 means that the poem was among the worst you have ever heard, as in it was super offensive. You had no idea what they were talking about. You wanted them to just stop talking. Like you were just begging for the next person to show up, right? I've never seen a 0.0 before, never in my life. You know what I'm saying? So I would even argue it's harder to get a 0.0 than a 10.0, right? However, a 10.0 is pretty darn hard to get. Now, that means it's among the best poems you've ever heard. It changed your life. You believe in unicorns and fairies. You've seen the light. You've been enlightened, right? Like, your worldview has completely changed. You're bawling your eyes out, things like that, right? So, like, a 10.0 is pretty darn hard to get as well. There's 3 minutes that each poem tends to have. Now, this varies sometimes, too. I've seen lightning rounds in which you only have 1 minute, right? I've seen some where you have up to even, like, 4 or 5 minutes, right? But 3 is a common thing I see. And then sometimes you get a 10-second grace period of sorts. So really it's like 3 minutes, 10 seconds. That's how long you really have. And then from 3 minutes, 10 seconds onward, you get 0.5 points deducted. And then every 10 seconds over time after, 0.5 gets deducted again and again and again, right? The highest and lowest scores are discarded by the scorekeeper. And the 3 middle scores that an individual received from the 5 poets, those are added up as the final score for that round, right? The reason for this removal of the highest and lowest scores is to limit bias-induced outliers, right? Say one of the judges just doesn't like how you look, or they don't like your race or your perceived gender, things like that. Well, they might give you a low score, and you can't really do anything about that, but we can limit things like that from happening by discarding the lowest score. And the same goes the other way around in terms of positive bias. Say somebody is like, oh, you have a shirt that looks really awesome, or I don't know, I'm really attracted to you, so I'm just going to give you a 10, right? Removing the highest score also gets rid of that bias as well. And yeah, the poet or the team that receives the highest cumulative score after the competition ends up winning, right? So yeah, let's get into common slam poetry topics. Some things you tend to see would be social justice related or injustice related poems, right? So you might see the mention of police brutality, slavery, racism, patriarchy, politics, gerrymandering, and so on and so forth. Issues with one's identity or celebration of one's identity, right? It doesn't have to always be negative. It might be things pertaining to race, sexual orientation, class, gender, nationality, faith, etc. Someone might be diving into their personal plight or their personal experiences due to, maybe abuse, poverty, relationships, mental health, right? You might also see things like pop culture references, right? So maybe someone mentioning Beyonce or Jay-Z or Will Smith or whatever. You might see references to TV shows such as Game of Thrones or How to Get Away with Murder, movie references, music, books, sports, things like that, right? So slam poetry is broad in terms of the topics that it covers. I mean broad. So it's for everybody. I would argue I don't think anyone can justifiably say they don't like slam poetry, because there's going to be a poem for you that you end up hearing. You feel me? All right. So what are some types of slams? You have team slams, right? And then you have solo slams. Solo slams, as the name implies, there's no teams. So it's just individuals going up against individuals. As for team slams, there are two types of pieces you might end up hearing. One would be group pieces, and they usually vary from 2 to 5 members. I've seen 6 before. I've seen actually even more than 6, but 2 to 5 is what I often see in terms of the amount of members that can spit one poem together on stage. And then I've also seen independent pieces during team slams in which an individual from a team will go up and recite a poem, right? So yeah, there's that. Next up, we've got common structures within a slam, right? I say structures, it could be practices as well. These also vary by slam, so I don't want you to think I'm making blanket statements of how all slams are. I know some vary, but here's some common things I've noticed. The first round's order of contestants is decided at random, such as, drawing numbers from a hat, or like drawing straws and going from like the longest straw drawn to the lowest. In the rounds that follow, the contestants perform in the order of highest scoring poet from the previous round to the lowest scoring poet of the previous round. In other words, what I'm really trying to say is that, say I'm in the first round and I get a really high score, higher than anybody else, right? I go first the next round, right? And then the person who got the lowest score the previous round gets the lowest score. The reason for that, I can get into in another video covering slam theory and things like that. But yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. There tend to be multiple bouts if it's like a really big, extensive slam. And a bout is pretty much a series of rounds, right? And these bouts are often independent in scoring from the others, right? So there are 2 kinds of bout systems I've kind of noticed, and they don't really have names as far as I know. So I've dubbed one kind the Battle Royale. I can't talk. I've dubbed one the Battle Royale style, right? And these pretty much have preliminary rounds, semifinals, and finals, right? So in the preliminaries, all contestants compete in 1 or more rounds against everyone, like all the contestants, for limited spots in the semifinals, right? The highest scores of the prelims compete in 1 or more rounds against each other for limited spots in the finals. And then those in the finals are people who had the highest scores in the semifinals, and they compete against one another to get the highest score of all to win, right? So that's pretty much the Battle Royale style. But there's another kind, and I call this the playoff tournament style. And it's kind of like, if you know basketball, if you know NBA, right, we have like brackets, Eastern Conference and Western Conference, right? So the playoff tournament style will have like brackets A and B, or maybe even A, B, and C, right? And if you win in your respective brackets, you will then compete against those at the top of each bracket for like a championship, so to speak, right? Or finals. So yeah, that's my weird NBA reference, but hopefully that made sense. And by the way, y'all miss anything or if I wasn't clear on anything, comment in the comment section. You know, it's there for a reason. Anyway, so common practices I tend to notice would be engagement from the audience. So you as the audience freely permitted to clap, snap, cheer, laugh. There can even be a call and response between the poet on stage and the audience, right? All that really matters is that you don't disrupt or distract the poet with any, jeering or anything like that. Choreography is a big thing in slam poetry. It's not just the words in the poem you're reciting, but how you recite it, right? So maybe like your hand gestures, the facial expressions you're making, things like that. That can really go into adding flavor for your poem, right? I've seen singing or body percussion. I've seen beatboxing, hitting your chest, clapping your hands as you're reciting the poem. It has to be original work. I don't think I've ever seen a slam where you have to recite someone else's or you get to. I mean, maybe. No, I've never heard of that. There's so many slams out there, maybe, but for the most part, it has to be your original work, right? Sportsmanship, that's a big deal. So, like, if you're competing against other people, it's good to have, like, friendly, competitive spirit between one another, but you don't want it to be toxic in any kind of way. And for most slams I've seen, it's been very good in that regard. Respect is a really big issue. I mean, a big issue, not just between contestants, but also in terms of those who might be in the audience. You don't want to say anything bigoted or offensive, or, don't perpetuate stereotypes, things like that. Or not perpetuate stereotypes. Don't play off of stereotypes from other people. That's what I meant to say. And then, it's community centered, right? So there's communities based around slam. A lot of the friends I've made throughout my college years has been through Kook Slam, which is actually a poetry organization at the University of Houston, right? And some of those people are my best friends. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's because of how community-centered slam actually is, right? Okay, so where might one find slams? This is the most important thing. All right, I hear people always ask me this, like, Kenny, I want to compete in a slam or even just an open mic, but I don't know where to go. I want to, try some of my poems out. I want to compete. I want to get better. All right, well, I got y'all. There's bars, lounges, university or college campuses, cafes, convention halls, and even now during quarantine, we have Instagram or Zoom, which will allow for virtual slams, right? I actually judged for a virtual slam with Kook Slam fairly recently. I'd say about a month and a half ago. Really amazing. So, like, honestly, there's so much available for you even now during quarantine. So, yeah, that's pretty much that. Again, shameless plug. Like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and comment below if you want more videos like this, all right? One more thing. Follow your boy on Instagram at Kendrick_Youngblood. And that's it. I am out.